Oh, Mr. Holman, that's such a great song. Beatles are one of my favorite older groups.
I'm
So,
surprised
would
you even
you
know
start
who
off?
the Beatles are.
No, you what's that?
So I'm surprised you even know who the Beatles are as young as you are. Little child.
Oh, so why don't you start off and explain to us why that song is such a good introduction to this lesson today?
Well, the whole Renaissance is a revolution. It's a revolution that takes place, and it's about the changing of the world. And in that song, he says everybody wants to change the world, and this is a time of total drastic change that fundamentally makes the world we live in today. And so, first, I guess we should talk a little bit about what we mean by it's a revolution. So, the first thing we need to understand: this isn't a revolution about guns and armies and navies, like you might see if we thought about the Revolutionary War. So that was a nice little add on that picture. So we're not talking about that kind of a revolution. We're talking about a revolution inside the human mind. And so we're talking really, so as I draw my little X on this, right? We're really talking about this side over here, how people think about the world and how they look at the world. So we're not talking about guns. So it's that kind of revolution.
Awesome. Yeah. So, Renaissance, couple things. Big keyword with the Renaissance, like you said, would be revolution. And yeah, let's get started.
Right. We'll add this though. The Renaissance means is French for the rebirth. So it's the rebirth of society, and you've got the years there, 1350 to 1700. So we're going to take a look at the background, what really led to this, and make sure kids understand those fundamental ideas.
Okay. And in order to talk about what led to this, I think, like you said, we have to go back to what idea and notion is being reborn. So, we have the classical age where the Europeans could worry less about dying and staying alive and actually concentrate on what we'll call living and having the positive life experience and having fun. So, things like the glory of Rome, the Colosseum that can come in here, the amphitheater, Roman law, all these wonderful things that existed during the time of Rome. Though I guess I completely skipped over Greece before that, but same concept with Greece and Rome.
Well, it's really important too for the kids to recognize that anytime they typically see the word the classic age, that is looking back at Greece and Rome. And I'm drawing on my iPad and it looks a little different on the screen. That was circling classic age, but it's a little moved. But that idea of the classic age is always looking back to Greece and Rome, the greatness of Greece and Rome. So the reference of the classic age always means Greece and Rome. So, yep, things were really good for Greece and Rome. And then some bad things seemed to happen. And I guess we'll move on.
And go ahead. We'll let you take the start on this one here.
Well, the Middle Ages, I think the first thing we want to check off is the Dark Ages down here. We need to think about that for a minute and what that implies. So the Dark Ages was a time period where there was very, very little formal education. There wasn't a lot of new invention and new creation. The world didn't seem to progress like it had in the classical period. So you saw a time period where people basically lived in this feudal society. And in that feudal society, they lived virtually on the manor they were born in. They spent their entire life within 20 to 25 miles of the place they were born and never saw anything about the world. And that creates a system where people aren't learning. They aren't focused outward. They're focused inward. And there was so much fear and lack of, chaos is what we talked about in class. There's a lot of chaos in Europe. So people were just worried about making it to live through to the next day. It wasn't about enjoying life or trying to get educated or to move up in the social structure. You were born and you were pretty much stuck where you were. So I think we need to just make sure everybody understands that Dark Ages means a lot more than, or implies all of these interesting ideas. But the Crusades, on the other hand, they made a different kind of check. When the Europeans traveled down to the Holy Land and began to interact with the Asian world and the Islamic world, and what we would call the Holy Land today, they brought back tons of ideas to Europe. They brought back silk, they brought back spices, they brought back apricots. They just brought back a wealth of knowledge that started to make Europeans look at the world differently. Instead of looking internally on their manner, they began to look outward. And then, of course, came the famous Black Death. If you want to take a swing at that one real quick, I'll get rid of some of this for you.
Yeah, so Black Death started in Asia and was spread pretty quickly through trade routes, and definitely with the aid of the Mongols, and them making that whole trip from Asia to Europe a little safer, once again. With the Silk Road, that really helps spread the Black Death, and they used to credit it to these little guys here. Though recently there has been some new articles saying that it wasn't actually spread by rats, but they were thinking that it might have actually been spread by gerbils, which I think is interesting that, hundreds of years later, we're still not entirely sure what caused that spread, but that might have been a discussion for another day, right?
Yeah, and that's ironic. That's important to think about history, that we think we know things, and as time passes, we learn new things that kind of question what we know. But as the story stands now, the Black Death kind of starts in China and spreads its way through Europe. And those years were 1347 through 51. So in that time period, you notice this date, this 51, if we start the Renaissance at around 1350, we're right there. This is when things change. And so the Black Death killed off so many Europeans that the feudal system that you pulled up so nicely before, which maybe you'll pull that hierarchy up again, the hierarchy kind of collapses. There's nothing really there for that system to maintain. The peasants can move to the cities, they can get jobs. Many of the knights no longer are working for the nobles, so the whole system kind of collapses. So we're seeing drastic change just from the Black Death. It kind of creates the atmosphere for everything to change. And so I guess we'll move on to the next slide. Anything you want to add there?
No, I think that we'll add a little bit when we get to this slide, with, like you were saying, with the increase of the trade, and, the Mongols bringing these, or the Mongols making this Silk Road safer to travel again, which is one positive thing from the Crusades, and that occurred as well, though they didn't go against with the Mongols, but the same idea that trade and new ideas are being shared and taken from point A to point B. And then you've got the image of the guy in the bottom left-hand corner, which is one of Holman's beloved characters. So I'll let him take the reign there.
Well, and I guess the first thing is I put a bunch of light bulbs up there, because all of a sudden their ideas are opened up. The light has, or I guess the darkness is lifted. It's a new sunrise in Europe. And so Marco Polo is an important character to our story. And I don't know that they do justice about talking about him in the books and the things you're going to read. But Marco Polo, to make a long story short, is from Italy. He travels to China. So he takes, it's a long time. And he sits on the court of the Khan, who takes over and unifies China. And he sits on that court, and he is able to learn all about China. After approximately 25 to 30 years, he goes home to Venice. And when he gets back to Venice, Venice is in a civil war, and he's put in jail. And he happens to get a cellmate who is a writer. And he starts telling him the stories of what he saw in China. And he describes the cities as being made of gold, that the buildings were all made of gold and the city was made of gold. And this man wrote this down, and it became a book called The Travels of Marco Polo. Well, when Marco Polo writes this book, or he doesn't write it, but when it's written, there's a new invention of a guy you're going to come along, and his name is Johann Gutenberg, and he's from Germany, who created something called the printing press. And again, he gets credit for it, although there were printing presses in other parts of the world, including over here. There were printing presses, but they were slightly different. You'll read about Johann Gutenberg, and he publishes, they mass produce this book. And for the first time, Europeans think of, I guess I'll put it in the most positive way I can make it, and I'm going to change it to this color. They start to see this part of the world that way. They see some money over there and some wealth, and it's going to draw their attention. And that opens up Europe to more cultural diffusion. They want more. they're now, like we said in the quote, they're now living life to enjoy it to some degree. There's a middle class rising in Europe, so these people want goods, they want fine silks. Even the clothes Marco Polo's wearing are probably Chinese in that image. You know, he's got silks, he's got jewelry on. So this desire for those goods, they've opened their minds. These light bulbs are going off all over Europe. They're going to be ready to go now.
Yeah. One thing that I just think it's a really, really interesting fact is that during the time of Rome, this item of silk was worth more than its own weight in gold, which I just think is really remarkable, and that it was valued that much and people were that interested in it, even in the classical age, which when we get to the Renaissance, we're talking about the rebirth of that classical age. It's ironic to me that there's a rebirth of the value of silk as well.
Yes, and I tried to put a little bank on there, that idea that there's a lot of money over there waiting for you. So they're going to try to find ways to get that gold. So that, I guess, takes our next slide.
All right. So this image is, Mr. Holman and I both were talking about this image and thought it was a good representation of the Renaissance, and I do want to just reiterate once again that the Renaissance is a French word for rebirth, and in this case, we're gonna use the analogy of a flower, and the entire flower itself is the Renaissance. The roots, the beginnings of that stems from the classical seed, or the classical age. Referring to the Greeks and the Romans, and everything that the Renaissance is, in large part, is based off of the classical age. And I think we kind of jumped over this little piece, but that classical age, the information, the knowledge of that was saved by what group of people?
The Islamic culture.
So, there's really a thank you that needs to be deserved in that sense.
Right. The Library at Alexandria, for example, or libraries in the Middle East, basically stored many of the copies of Greek and Roman knowledge. And so they continue to build on it, as people died in the classical age and Rome fell and everything was burned. The Muslims continue to build on that knowledge and go deeper into math and look at trigonometry and do things at a higher level, while the Europeans were in that dark age. But I think that's that idea of the seed. It was the classical seed that was there. And if we're thinking of just Europe, if you actually try to envision this as being Europe, that seed was always in the ground, was always there. But during the Middle Ages, a few things maybe happened. So you had maybe the Crusades added another root, because all of a sudden they could see now that the world had something to offer. And, other things were happening that were kind of helping these roots to grow during the Middle Ages. But it's not until we get to this time period of the Renaissance where that flower bursts from the ground. And there were a couple of things that made that flower grow. Because this seed sat there for 1,000 years, maybe 1,500 years, and it couldn't grow. It couldn't expand. So something had to happen. And that is this idea here that comes in next.
So in order for the seeds to begin to grow, they need water. So in this case, the travel and the commerce is representing that water. And the big thing to talk about once again here, and we've talked about it a little bit earlier too, was this idea of cultural diffusion. And, when people travel, they bring new ideas back with them. They bring new products back with them. They are able to bring those products back. They're able to sell those products to make money. And, the ideas that are brought back, and I'm just going to state it again, that the Islamic, the Alexandria, the Library of Alexandria, is trying to pull up here, is a huge idea, or, is where a lot of the ideas came back from and helped continue that growth of that flower.
Well, and that's an interesting painting you bring up, because that painting is the school of Athens. I'm sorry, and in that, it's a Renaissance painting that is going back and looking at all the famous people. So in this case, you've got different famous people, Euclid and all of these people are drawn in here because they're looking back to the knowledge of that time period. But I think the key idea you said is this is what's really watering the flower, is these new ideas and the new trade. And as it waters it, two things happen. Obviously, you get the tree that begins to grow. So you have some shrubs grow. But we need two more things. And I think we'll take this thing last because it maybe is the most important. And we'll talk a little bit about this. How do you fertilize a plant? You know, today you drop fertilizer on the ground, and that encourages the plant and the roots to grow and to get bigger. Well, in this case, the growth of the city-state is the idea that governments develop. And the governments really did two things for Renaissance and the idea of art. First, they put money behind new ideas. Pardon me?
I was going to say paying for exploration.
Yeah, they began to pay for exploration for people to explore. They want to find a new route to China, so they're not paying middlemen, and that's something we'll talk about later. And they also started to spend this vast wealth that people collected. There were bankers that were just collecting money and money and money. And they said, you know what, let's make where we live beautiful. And they began to commission. Now, it's a big word, but it basically means I have enough money to pay someone to build a statue in the middle of town, and I can let them work on it for a year, and I can pay them. So there was all of a sudden a surplus of money, some provided by the government and some provided by individual people, that allowed them to build something like David. Although David's probably not the accurate one for the beautification of the city, but that is the most classic Renaissance statue in the world.
And it was commissioned, which makes it fitting that, you know, somebody like you said paid the money to have the statue of David built. You know, it was put inside, so it wasn't quite for the beautification of the entire city, but it definitely is now. It's definitely one of the main tourist attractions, or one of the major tourist attractions in the area.
Oh yeah, it clearly is. And it's beautiful. They'll look at that as they go through the quest. And then I think that takes us to the last one, and that's this word humanism. So we should know that no plant can grow without sunlight. And the sunlight is what provides the ultimate food source for a plant to be able to flourish. So humanism, simply put, is this definition that people began to focus on human abilities and human greatness, that they can do great things, is the way I like to view this. So there's this idea, and I guess we have to think of it that way. It's an idea. And it's an idea that kind of permeates all of Europe at the time. And that idea said that people can solve problems. So it's a turning away from the church. People begin to start to look away a little bit from the cross and start to think about humans' ability and what life is about when you're alive. And that's where your quote comes in. You know, this is a time when Europeans worried less about dying and concentrated more on living. So it's that simple philosophy all the way back to the classic world of there's beauty in life. There's beauty in what we do on a daily basis. And we should focus on that sum and focus on enjoying the life we live. That is a major, major change from the Middle Ages, where life was a drudgery and it was terrible and people were basically only looking to the afterlife. So is there anything you want to add with humanism about that?
No, I mean, I think you kind of, the only other thing I was going to say, but I think you kind of hit it there on the end, was that, you know, in the Middle Ages, every aspect of life revolved around the church. So it is a big mind shift in Europe, this idea of humanism, and it sparks so many things, which, you know, are the flowers of the, where I guess, where you're going to say where the flowers are blooming here with art and learning. So these are some of the things that the beautiful things that come out of the Renaissance. You know, there's also education, there's science, there's architecture, and all of those things. And you guys will learn about that as you go through. Well, anyway, one of my favorite things to talk about and for you guys to learn about all year is the printing press. So you'll definitely get to hear about that soon, and I'm excited for you.
Well, because you said it, I'm going to comment. We need to make sure kids understand the church doesn't just disappear. The church is, you know, it doesn't become totally unpowerful. And the church actually responds to humanism. They feel that it's such a threat to church power that you will read something called Christian humanism, where the church comes out and says, yeah, humans are great, but there's a Christian element to humanism. So they try to combat this idea of the power of the human. So you're going to see that too as we progress. So the Renaissance is a fascinating time, and it ultimately is the time that, as we sit here today and look at the world around us, many of the most basic ideas of American culture and culture that we lead are really born. They're really these seeds. And this tree has continued to grow. And this humanistic spirit has continued to lead us to where we are today. And I think with that, I think we're pretty much done for tonight. Do you think so?
Yep, I agree. Thank you.
All right. Well, good luck, kids. And hopefully you find the Renaissance an impressive, and actually, hopefully you just find it beautiful. The artwork is beautiful. So I hope you take some time to enjoy what humans are capable of creating. Have a good night.